In the Mahabharata, one of ancient India's two great epics, there's a scene where a flying chariot called the Pushpaka Vimana carries its passengers silently through the sky, moving at the will of its rider, capable of traveling vast distances between kingdoms in a single journey. In the Ramayana, that same chariot appears again, described as shining like the sun, large enough to carry an army, able to move according to the thoughts of the person guiding it. For thousands of years, Indian literature has described these Vimanas, flying vehicles belonging to gods and kings, woven into some of the oldest and most celebrated stories in the world. And for just as long, most people reading those stories understood them exactly the way you'd understand a flying carpet in a folk tale or a chariot pulled across the sky by fire in Greek mythology, as extraordinary literary imagination, a sign of just how ambitious and vivid ancient Indian storytelling could be. Then, in the early 20th century, one specific text appeared that changed the entire conversation, claiming these weren't myths at all, but genuine engineering blueprints for real aircraft thousands of years ahead of their time. The text is called the Vaimanika Shastra, and the true story behind where it actually came from is honestly more fascinating than any conspiracy theory built on top of it. If you're the kind of person who wants the full, honest history behind claims like this, rather than the exaggerated version, go ahead and subscribe now, because we're about to walk through exactly what's verified, what's genuinely uncertain, and what has already been conclusively settled. Let's start with what's actually old here, because this part isn't in dispute at all. References to Vimanas genuinely do appear throughout classical Sanskrit literature, stretching back well over 2,000 years. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata both describe them in vivid detail, as do other later texts, including one called the Samarangana Sutradhara, which describes several named types of Vimanas, supposedly built for specific deities. These aren't obscure or cherry-picked references either. Flying vehicles show up repeatedly and consistently across a huge body of ancient Indian religious and epic literature. In the same way, flying horses, sky chariots, and divine airborne journeys appear throughout Greek, Norse, and countless other ancient mythological traditions around the world. Nobody seriously studying comparative mythology or Sanskrit literature disputes that these ancient descriptions exist, or that they represent a genuinely rich and imaginative literary tradition. The disagreement, and this is the entire crux of the modern controversy, isn't about whether ancient Indian texts describe flying vehicles. It's about whether one particular, much more recent document, one that claims to be an actual engineering manual for building these vehicles, is genuinely ancient, or something else entirely. That document is the Vaimanika Shastra, and its actual history begins not thousands of years ago, but in a village in the Hosur region of southern India, with a man named Pandit Subbaraya Shastri, who was born in 1866. According to a detailed study later conducted by researchers at the Indian Institute of Science, Shastri's early life was genuinely difficult. His parents died when he was young, and by most accounts, he grew up in real poverty. At some point in his life, he encountered a spiritual teacher in the town of Kolar, and following that encounter, he began dictating what he described as ancient, divinely revealed knowledge about the construction of flying machines. Material, he claimed, had been spiritually channeled to him directly from an ancient sage named Maharishi Bharadvaja. One detail from that same IISC research stands out as genuinely important context. Shastri reportedly could not read or write before this spiritual experience and only learned afterward. Between 1918 and 1923, he dictated roughly 3,000 verses across 8 chapters to a scribe, describing the construction, propulsion, and operation of various flying vehicles, including exotic-sounding technology like mercury vortex engines and specific types of named aircraft such as the Rukma Vimana and the Shakuna Vimana. For decades after that dictation, the text remained relatively obscure. It wasn't until 1952 that a man named G.R. Josier publicly revealed its existence to the wider world, and a Hindi translation followed in 1959, with a full Sanskrit and English edition eventually published in 1973. And once it reached a broader audience, particularly among readers already interested in the idea of a technologically advanced ancient past, it became something of a foundational text for a much larger claim, that ancient India had actually developed real, functional aircraft technology thousands of years before the Wright brothers, technology that had somehow been completely lost to history. Here's where the story could have simply ended as an interesting but unresolved historical curiosity. Instead, in 1974, a team of 5 researchers, all from the aeronautical and mechanical engineering departments at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, decided to actually test the claim directly and rigorously, rather than simply arguing about it from a distance. Their approach was refreshingly straightforward. If the Vaimanika Shastra genuinely described real functional aircraft designs, then those designs should hold up to basic scrutiny from people who actually understood aeronautical engineering. So that's exactly what they did. They carefully examined the technical descriptions and diagrams in the text, evaluated them against the fundamental principles of aerodynamics and Newtonian physics, and published their findings in a detailed paper titled A Critical Study of the Work Vaimanika Shastra. Their conclusions were direct and unambiguous. Looking specifically at one of the described aircraft, the Rukma Vimana, the researchers stated plainly that if the craft were taken to mean exactly what its accompanying drawing and text described, it would represent, in their own words, a decided impossibility. More broadly, across the text as a whole, they concluded that the described planes were, again in their own phrasing, poor concoctions, rather than genuine expressions of anything real, violating basic aeronautical principles and fundamental laws of motion that any working aircraft, ancient or modern, would necessarily have to obey. Beyond just the physics, their research also dug into the text's actual origins, tracing its documented history and concluding that it could not be reliably traced back further than approximately 1904, squarely within Subbaraya Shastri's own lifetime, rather than the ancient Vedic era the text itself claimed to originate from. And here's a piece of evidence that genuinely deserves more attention than it usually gets in this conversation, because it's about as close to a smoking gun as historical document analysis ever produces. To date, no manuscript of the Vaimanika Shastra has ever been found predating 1918, the exact year Subbaraya Shastri began dictating it. Not a single fragment, not a single earlier reference, nothing. For a text claiming to preserve genuinely ancient Vedic-era engineering knowledge, the complete absence of any older physical copy, anywhere, in any archive, temple collection, or private library across all of India, is a significant problem that proponents of the text's antiquity have never been able to satisfactorily explain. If you're the kind of person who appreciates watching researchers actually test an extraordinary claim with real methodology instead of just arguing about it on social media, hit that subscribe button, because this story actually got a second, very public chapter more than 4 decades after that original 1974 study. And it happened on a genuinely major stage. In January of 2015, at the 102nd Indian Science Congress in Mumbai, one of the country's largest and most prestigious annual gatherings of scientists, a retired airline pilot named Captain Anand Bodas, along with his co-presenter Ameya Jadhav, were scheduled to deliver a talk titled Ancient Indian Aviation Technology, drawing directly on the Vaimanika Shastra as supporting evidence. In interviews leading up to the talk, Bodas made some genuinely striking claims. He stated that these ancient aircraft had been massive in size, capable of traveling not just between countries, but between entire planets, and that unlike modern aircraft, which can only fly forward, these ancient vehicles could supposedly move left, right, and even backward. He also described specific details drawn from the text, including a particular diet for pilots involving the milk of buffalo, cow, and sheep, and clothing woven from vegetation grown underwater. The announcement triggered immediate, serious pushback from within India's own scientific community, well before the talk even took place. A petition calling for the lecture to be pulled from the program gathered hundreds of signatures. Professor Radham Narasimha, the former director of India's National Aerospace Laboratories, stated plainly that there was no credible account of aviation technology existing in ancient India. Professor H. S. Mukunda, one of the original 5 researchers behind the 1974 IISc study, publicly criticized the decision to include the talk at all, pointing out that if the presenters genuinely believed their claims, the obvious next step would have been to actually build a working model based on the text's specifications, something nobody advocating for the Vaimanika Shastra's authenticity has ever successfully done in over a century since Subbaraya Shastri first began dictating it. Perhaps most notably, renowned Indian astrophysicist Jayant Narlikar weighed in publicly as well, making a point that honestly cuts to the heart of this entire debate. He said that it was good and reasonable to take pride in India's genuine, extensively documented scientific and mathematical achievements throughout history, but that scientists specifically should avoid making claims about things for which no actual evidence exists, since doing so risks undermining the credibility of the country's real, verifiable historical accomplishments in the eyes of the wider world. Despite the controversy, the talk did go forward as scheduled. And notably, according to reporting from the Indian Express at the time, most attendees at that 2015 session were apparently never even informed that the specific text being cited had already been directly studied and thoroughly debunked by credentialed aeronautical engineers 41 years earlier at one of India's own most respected scientific institutions. So here's where the evidence honestly, transparently lands, without exaggeration in either direction. The idea of flying vehicles in ancient Indian literature is genuinely ancient, genuinely rich. It deserves to be studied and appreciated as exactly what it is, an extraordinary imaginative literary tradition stretching back well over 2,000 years, no less impressive or worthy of study than similar traditions found in Greek, Norse, or virtually any other ancient mythology around the world. But the Vaimanika Shastra specifically, the text most frequently cited as physical proof that these vehicles were real, functioning aircraft, has a well-documented traceable origin in the early 20th century, dictated by a specific named individual whose own personal history is reasonably well understood, and its technical content has been rigorously tested against real aeronautical and physical principles by credentialed engineers, not once, but repeatedly, and found to be fundamentally unworkable as an actual flying machine. It's genuinely worth pausing here to consider why this particular claim is held on so persistently for over a century, because I don't think the honest answer is simply that people enjoy being fooled. Ancient India produced genuinely remarkable, well-documented achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and metallurgy, discoveries and advances that took Western science centuries to independently rediscover or properly credit. The concept of zero as a number, advanced surgical techniques described in ancient medical texts, sophisticated astronomical calculations. Against that backdrop of genuine, verifiable accomplishment, the idea that ancient India might have also achieved powered flight thousands of years before the rest of the world doesn't feel like an outlandish leap, so much as a natural extension of an already impressive, well-earned historical legacy. That emotional and cultural pull is completely understandable, and it's precisely why researchers like Narlikar were so careful to separate the two categories clearly. Take genuine, deserved pride in what the historical evidence actually, verifiably supports, while being honest and careful about claims that evidence simply doesn't back up, however appealing those claims might feel. There's also something worth sitting with about Subbaraja Shastri himself, because his individual story, when you actually dig into the historical record, is genuinely more interesting than the caricature he sometimes gets reduced to in this debate. Here was a man who grew up in real poverty, lost both parents young, and reportedly couldn't even read or write until later in his life. Whatever the true nature of his spiritual experience actually was, whether he genuinely believed he was channeling ancient wisdom or was drawing on his own remarkable imagination and creativity, he produced 3,000 verses of intricate, internally consistent technical description covering propulsion systems, pilot training, aircraft materials, and operational procedures, dictated entirely from memory over a period of 5 years. That's a genuinely significant creative and intellectual achievement in its own right, regardless of whether the aircraft he described could ever actually leave the ground. Several researchers studying this history have made a similar observation. Whatever the Vaimanika Shastra actually is, it stands as compelling evidence of something, just not the something its most enthusiastic modern promoters usually claim. It's evidence of one specific, creative, self-taught man's imagination in early 20th century India, working through a genre and a tradition, flying Vimanas drawn straight from the epics he'd grown up hearing, and building something remarkably elaborate and internally consistent on top of it. So, if someone brings up ancient Indian flying machines to you at a dinner party, or you come across a video online making dramatic claims about secret suppressed aviation technology from thousands of years ago, here's the honest, complete picture worth knowing. Yes, Vimanas genuinely appear throughout ancient Sanskrit epic literature, exactly as described, going back well over 2 millennia, and that's a real rich literary tradition worth studying and appreciating on its own considerable merits. No, the specific text most commonly cited as physical engineering proof of their existence, the Vaimanika Shastra, cannot be reliably traced back further than the early 1900s, and its author's own documented personal history is reasonably well understood by researchers who've actually looked into it. And when its specific technical claims were rigorously tested against real aeronautical engineering and basic physics, not once, but on more than one occasion, by credentialed scientists working independently and decades apart, the described aircraft simply, consistently failed to hold up as functional flying machines by every measure that was actually testable. None of that makes the underlying ancient mythology itself any less genuinely fascinating. If anything, understanding the real documented history here, an imaginative, self-taught spiritual dictation from a specific man in a specific village in a specific decade, building on genuinely ancient literary traditions and epic imagery that are thousands of years old, is arguably a far more interesting and human story than a straightforward, unverifiable claim of a mysteriously lost, forgotten ancient super technology ever was to begin with. If getting the honestly researched, fully verified version of a story like this instead of the exaggerated one is exactly what you come to this channel for, make sure you're subscribed, because we've got a lot more of these to get through, separating the genuinely fascinating true history from the version that only sounds true, and I'll see you in the next one.